3, 2.
Welcome back, everybody. Chapter 2. Roast mutton. Up jumped Bilbo, putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room, and there he saw nobody. But all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe the party of the night before had not been a part of his bad dreams, and that he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved, after all, to think that they had gone without him, and without bothering to wake him up, but with never a thank you, he thought, and yet in a way that he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. And this feeling surprised him. "Oh, don't be a fool, Baggins," he said to himself, thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age. So he put on an apron, lit fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining room. By that time the sun was shining, the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget all about the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the window, the open window, when in walked Gandalf. "My dear fellow," said he, "whenever are you going to come? What about an early start? Here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, at 10:30. They left you the message because they could not wait." "What message?" said poor Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster. "Great elephants," said Gandalf. "You are not at all yourself this morning. You have never dusted the mantelpiece." "What's that got to do with it? I've had enough to do with washing up for 14. "If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock," said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, on his own notepaper. And this is what he read. "Thorin and Company, to Burglar Bilbo greeting. For your hospitality, our sincerest thanks, and for the offer of your professional assistance, our greatest acceptance. Terms, cash on delivery, up to and not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All travelling expenses and guaranteed in any event. Funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed repose, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp. Trusting that you will be punctual, we have the honour to remain yours deeply, Thorin and Co." "That leaves you 10 minutes. You'll have to run," said Gandalf. But no time for it. But no time for that either. Go off you go." To the end of his days, Bilbo could never remember how he found himself outside without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything he usually took when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, pushing his keys into Gandalf's hands, and running as fast as his furry feet would carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on and on for a mile or more. Very puffed he was when he got to Bywater just on the stroke of 11 and found he had come without a pocket handkerchief. "Bravo," said Balin, who was standing at the inn door just looking out for him. And then all the others came round the corner of the road from the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of baggages, packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a very small pony, apparently for Bilbo. Up you two get, and off we go." "Well, I'm awfully sorry," said Bilbo, "but I've come without my hat, and I left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money, and I didn't get your note till after 10:45 to be precise." "Don't be precise," said Dwalin. "Don't be precise," said Dwalin, "and don't worry, you have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs and a good many things other before you get to the journey's end. As for a hat, I've got a spare hood and a cloak in my luggage." And that is how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn one fine morning just before May on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were much too large for him, and he looked rather comic. What his father, Bungo, would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They'd not been riding very long, and Gandalf came up on a very splendid white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after that, the party went along very merrily, and they told stories and sang songs, and they rode forward all day, except, of course, when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked them, but still he began to feel that the adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country inhabited by decent folk with good roads, an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or farmer ambling along by doing his own business. And then they came to lands where people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone far into the lonesome lands where there were no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and dark with trees. And on some of them were old castles with an evil look, as if some of them had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lowlands, they had been obliged to camp where they could, but at least it had been dry. To think it will soon be June, grumbled Bilbo as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was, after tea time, it was pouring with rain and had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes and his cloak was full of water. The pony was tired and stumbled on stones. The others were too grumpy to talk. Oh, and I'm sure the rain has got into my dry clothes and into the food bags, thought Bilbo. Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I'd stayed at home in my nice hole by the fire with the kettle just beginning to sing. It was not the last time he had wished that. Still the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking any notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark. And as they went down in a deep valley with a river at the bottom, wind got up, and willows along its banks bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river, swollen with the rains, came rushing down the hills and the mountains in the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed over. The wind broke up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills between the flying rags. And then they stopped, and Thorin muttered something about supper and where are we going to get a dry patch to sleep on. Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he had come all the way with them, never saying if he was in the adventure or merely keeping them company for a while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he simply was not there at all. Oh, just when a wizard would have been most useful too, groaned Dorian Nori, who shared the hobbit's views about regular meals plenty and often. They decided in the end they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees, and though it was drier under them, the wind shook the rain off the leaves and drip. Oh, it was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have got into the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Oin and Gloin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright at nothing and bolted. He got into the river, and before they could catch him, and before they could get him out again, Philly and Killy were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that he carried was washed away off him. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for supper, and less for breakfast. They all sat there glum and wet and muttering, while Oin and Gloin were trying to light the fire and quarrelling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures are not all pony rides and nay sunshine, when Balin, who was always their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a little hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees they could now see a light shining, a reddish, comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell into arguing. Some said no, and some said yes, and some said they could but go see. But anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all night. Others said, "These parts They're none too well known, and they're too near the mountains. Travellers seldom come this way now. The old maps are no use. Things have changed for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom heard of the king round here. And the less inquisitive you are as you go along, the less trouble you're likely to find. Some said, after all, these are 14 of us. There are 14 of us. And others said, where has Gandalf got to? This was the remark repeated by everybody. The rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Oin and Gloin began to fight. That settled it. After all, we have got a burglar with us, they said, so off they made, leading their ponies with all due precaution in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as it might lead to a house or a farm, and do what they could do. Doing what they could do, they made a deal of rustling and crackling and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and dratting, as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly, the red light shone out very bright through the tree trunks not far ahead. Now it's the burglar's turn, they said, meaning Bilbo. You must go and find out all about that light and what it is for, and if it's perfectly safe and canny, said Thorin to the Hobbit. Now scuttle off and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. And if you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can. Well, off Bilbo had to go, but before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, or any more than he could like a fly, like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quite quickly and quietly in woods, absolutely quietly. They take a pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along, though I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if the whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. So naturally he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone. And this is what he saw. 3 very large persons sitting around a large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off with their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell, and there was a barrel of good drink at hand. They were drinking out of jugs, and they were trolls, obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that from the great heavy faces of them, their size and their shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing room fashion at all.
Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow,
said one of the trolls.
Never a blinking bit of man fresh have we had for long enough, said a second.
What the hell was William was a thinking of bringing us into these parts? It all beats me. And the drink running short once more,
he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William jugged.
Oh, shut your mouth,
he said as soon as he could.
You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be hit by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time has been up our way, where you'd have had a thank you bill for a nice bit of valley mutton like what this is.
And he took a big bite off the sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, even though with only one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try roasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a bit of good, quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would have done at this point at least picked the troll's pockets. It's nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched at the very the beer and walked off without even them noticing him. Others more practical, with less professional pride, would perhaps have stuck a dagger into to each of them before they observed him. And then that night they could have spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read of a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very alarmed and as well as disgusted, and he wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings that he had heard of picking trolls' pockets seemed to be the least difficult. So at last he crept behind the tree just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel, and William was having another drink. And then Bilbo plucked up courage, put his little hand into William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! He thought, warming to his new work as he carefully lifted out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are the mischief, and this was no exception. Here, who are you? It squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned around at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he could duck behind the tree. Blimey, Bert, look what I've cropped, said William. What is it? Said the others coming up behind him. Love me everything I know. What are you? Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over and wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him. A hobbit? What? They said, a little bit startled. Trolls are slow on the uptake and mightily suspicious about anything new to them. What's a hobbit got to do with my pocket anyways? Said William. And can you cook 'em? Said Tom. You can try, said Bert, picking up a skewer. Yeah, you wouldn't make 'em more than a mouthful, said William, who had already had a fine supper. Not when he was skinned and boned. Well, perhaps more like him roundabout, we might make a pie, said Bert. Here you are. Are there any more of your are there any more sneaking around in these here woods, you little nasty rabbit? He said, looking at the hobbit's furry feet, picked him up by the toes and shook him. Yes, lots. But before he remembered not to give his friends away. No, I mean, none at all. None at all. Not one, he said immediately afterwards. What do you mean? Said Bert, holding him up right away by his hair this time. Oh, what I'm saying, said Bilbo, gasping. Please don't cook me, sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I cook beautifully. I'll cook beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if only you won't have me for supper. Poor little blighter, said William. Oh, he has already had as much supper as he could hold. Also, he'd had lots of beer. Poor little blighter, let him go! Not till he says what he means by lots and none at all, said Bert. I don't want to have me throat cut in me sleep. Hold his toes over the fire until he talks. I won't have it, said William. I caught him anyway. You're a fat fool, William, said Bert, as I've said before this evening. And you're a lout. And I won't take that from you, Bill Huggins, said Bert. And he put his fist in William's eye, and there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left in him when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet before they were fighting like dogs and calling one another all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in each other's arms, rolling around nearly into the fire, kicking and thumping while Tom whacked at them both with a branch and bringing them to their senses. And that, of course, only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed in Bert's big paw, so he had no breath in his body with his head, and his head was going round. So he lay there for a while, panting, just outside the circle of the firelight. Right in the middle of the fight came Balin. The dwarves heard the noises from a distance, and after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back or hoot like an owl, they started off, one by one, to creep towards the light as quickly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come through into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately and said, "A sack, Tom, quick!" they said. Before Balin, who was wondering where in all this commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. A sack was over his head, and he was down. "There's more to come," said Tom, "or I'm a mighty mistook. Lots and none at all, it is," said he. "No borough hobbits, but lots of these here dwarfs,
That's about the shape of it. Yeah, I reckon you're right, said Bert. We'd better get out of the light.
And so they did. With sacks in their hands that they had used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waited in the shadows, and each dwarf came up and looked at the fire and spilled jugs and gnawed the mutton. In surprise, plop, went a nasty smelly sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Barlin, Philly, Killy together, and Dory, Nori, Ori, and Ori, all in a heap, and Oin and Groin and Biffer and Boffer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire.
Well, that'll teach them,
said Tom, for Biffer and Bomber had given a lot of trouble, fought like mad as dwarfs are when cornered. Thorin came last. He was not caught unawares. He came expecting mischief and didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell them the things that things were not all well. He stood outside the shadows some way off and said, "What is all this trouble?
Who has been knocking my people about?"
"It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They'd forgotten all about him. "They're hiding in the bushes with sacks." "Oh, are they?" said Thorin, and he jumped forward to the fire before they could leap on him. He caught a big branch all on fire at one end, and Bert got that end in his eye before he could step aside, and that put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick and as young as a young tree trunk, but then he was sent spinning up into the top of some sort of bushes, and when Tom kicked sparks up in Thorin's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that and lost one of the front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you, but just at that moment William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorin's head and down to his toes, and so the fight ended. A nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks, with 3 angry trolls, 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly or mince them fine and boil them, or just sit there one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo up in a bush with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move for fear they should hear him. It was just then when Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves, to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. And that was Bert's idea. And after a lot of argument, they had all agreed to it.
"No good roasting them now, it'll take all night,"
said a voice. Bert thought it was William's.
"Don't start the argument all over again, Bill," he said, "or it will take all night." "Who's arguing?" said William, who thought it was Bert who had spoken. "You are," said Bert. "You're a liar," said William.
And so the argument began all over again. And in the end, they decided to mince them fine and boil them. So they got a great black pot and they took out their knives.
"No good boiling them, we ain't got no water, and it's a long way to the well and all," said a voice.
Bert and William thought it was Tom's.
"Oh, shut up,"
they said.
"Well, we'll never have done. And you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more." "Oh, shut up yourself," said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. "Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know?" "You're a booby," said William. "Booby yourself," said Tom.
And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever, until at last they decided to sit on the sacks one by one, squash them, and then boil them next time.
"Who shall we sit on first?" "Better sit on the last fellow first," said Bert, whose eyes had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking. "Don't talk to yourself," said Tom. "But if he wants to sit on the last one, sit on him." "Which is he?" "The one with the yellow stockings," said Bert. "Nonsense, that's the one with the grey stockings," said a voice like William's. "I'm sure it was yellow." "Yellow it was," said William. "Then why did you say it was grey for?" said Bert. "I never did, Tom did." "That I never did," said Tom. "It was you. 2 to 1, so shut your mouth," said Bert. "Who are you talking to?" said William. "Now stop it," said Tom and Bert together. "The night is getting on and dawn's coming early, so get on with it." "Dawn take you all and stone be with you," said a voice that sounded like William's, but it wasn't. For just then, at that moment, the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood, turned to stone, and he stopped, and he stooped, and Bert and Tom were stuck like rocks as they looked at him. And there they stand to this day, all alone,
unless the birds perch on them. For trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains they are made of and never move again. And that is what happened to Bert and Tom and William. Excellent, said Gandalf as he stepped from behind a tree and helped Bilbo to climb down out of a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarrelling under the light until the light came and then made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarves. They were nearly suffocated and very annoyed, and they had not at all enjoyed lying there listening to the trolls and making plans for roasting them, squashing them and mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what had happened to them twice over before they were satisfied.
Oh, silly time to go practicing pinching and picketing, said Bomber, when what we wanted was fire and food.
And that's just what you would have got.
And that's just what you would have, and that's just what you wouldn't have got of those fellows without a struggle in any case, said Gandalf. Anyway, you're wasting time now. Don't you realize that the trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere near to hide, or to hide from the sun in? We must look into it.
So they searched about and soon found the marks of the trolls' stony boots going away through the trees, and they followed the tracks up the hill until, hidden by bushes, they came upon a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they couldn't open it. Not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. Would this be any good? Asked Bilbo when they were tired and angry. I found it on the ground when the trolls had their fight. He held out a largish key, though no doubt William had thought it very small and secret. It must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he was turned to stone.
Well, why on earth didn't you mention it before? They all cried.
Gandalf grabbed it and fitted it into the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back with one big push, and they were all inside. There were bones on the floor, and a nasty smell was in the air. But there was a good deal of food, jumbled carelessly on shelves and on the ground, among an untidy litter of plunder of all sorts, from brass buttons to pots full of gold coins standing in the corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls. I'm afraid they belonged to the victims. And among them were several swords of various makes, shapes and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly because of their beautiful scabbards and jewelled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for the hobbit.
Well, these look like good blades, said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously. These were not made by any troll, nor by any smith among men in these parts and days. But when we can read the runes on them, then we shall know more about them.
Oh, let's get out this horrible smell, said Philly. So they carried the pots, the coins, and such food as was untouched and looked fit to eat, and also one barrel which was of ale, which was still full. And by that time they felt like breakfast, and being very hungry, they did not turn their noses at what they had got from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty, but now they had bread and cheese and plenty of ale and bacon to toast in the embers of the fire. After that, they slept for the night. After that, they slept, for their night had been disturbed, and they did nothing more until the afternoon. And then they brought up their ponies and carried away the pots of gold and buried them very secretly, not far from the track, by the river, putting a great many spells over them, just in case they ever had the chance to come back and recover them. When that was done, they all mounted once more and jogged along again along the path towards the east.
Where did you go to, if I may ask? Said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along.
To look ahead, said he.
And what brought you back in the nick of time?
Looking behind, said he.
Exactly, said Thorin. But could you be more plain?
I went on to spy out our road. It will soon become dangerous and difficult, and also I was anxious about replenishing our small stock of provisions. I had not gone far, however, when I met a couple of friends of mine from Rivendell.
Where's that? Asked Bilbo.
Don't interrupt, said Gandalf. You will get there in a few days now, if we're lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I met two of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of the trolls. It was they who told me that 3 of them had come down from the mountains and settled in the woods not far from the road, that they had frightened everybody away from the district, and they waylaid strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking back, I saw the fire in the distance and made for it. So, now you know. Please, be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere.
Thank you, said Thorin. Chapter 3. A short rest. They did not sing or tell stories that day, even though the weather improved. Nor the next day, nor the day after. They had begun to feel that danger was not very far away on either side. They camped under the stars, and their horses had more to eat than they had, for there was plenty of grass. There was not much in their bags, even with what they had got from the trolls. One morning they forded a river at a wide, shallow place full of the noise of stones and foam. The far bank was steep and slippery. When they got off the top of it, leading their ponies, they saw the great mountains had marched down very near to them. Already they seemed only a day's easy journey from the foot of the nearest. Dark and drear it looked, though there were patches of sunlight on its brown sides, and behind its shoulders the tips of the snow peaks gleamed. "Is that the mountain?" said Bilbo, in a solemn voice, looking at it with his round eyes. He had never seen anything that looked that big before.
Of course not, said Balin. That is only the beginning of the Misty Mountains. And we have got to get through, or over, or under those somehow, before we can come to the Wilderland and beyond. And it is a great deal of a way, even from the other side of them, to the lonely mountain in the east, where Smaug lies unearthed treasure.
Oh, said Bilbo, and just at that moment he felt more tired than he ever remembered feeling tired before. He was thinking once again of his comfortable chair before the fire in his favourite sitting room in his hobbit hole, and that kettle singing. Not for the last time. Now Gandalf led the way.
We must not miss the road, or we shall be done for, he said. We need food, for one thing, and rest in reasonable safety. Also, it is very necessary to tackle the Misty Mountains by the proper path, or else you will get lost in them, and have to come back and start at the beginning again, if you ever get back at all.
They asked him where he was making for, and he answered,
You are to come to the very edge of the wild, as some of you may know, hidden there somewhere ahead of us in the fair valley of Rivendell, where Elrond lives in the last homely house. I have sent a message by my friends, and we are expected.
Well, that sounded nice and comforting, but they had not got there yet, and it was not so easy as it sounds to find the last homely house west of the mountains. There seemed to be no trees and no valleys and no hills to break up the ground before them, and only one vast slope going slowly up and up to meet the feet of the nearest mountain. A wide land, the colour of heather and crumbling rock, with patches and slashes of grass green and moss green showing where water might have been. Morning passed, afternoon came, but in all the silent waste there was no sign of any dwelling. They were growing anxious, for they saw now that the house might be hidden almost anywhere between them and the mountains. They came on unexpected valleys, narrow with steep sides that opened suddenly at their feet, and they looked down, surprised to see trees below them and running water at the bottom. There were gullies that they could almost leap over, with deep waterfalls in them. There were dark ravines that one could neither jump over nor climb into. There were bogs. Some of them were green, pleasant places to look at, with flowers growing bright and tall, but a pony that walked there with a pack on his back would never have come out again. It was indeed a much wider land from the ford to the mountains than ever you would have guessed. Bilbo was astonished. The only path was marked with white stones, some of which were small and others were half covered with moss or heather. Altogether, it was a very slow business following the track, even guided by Gandalf, who seemed to know his way about pretty well. His head and beard wagged this way and that as he looked for the stones, and they followed his lead, but they seemed no nearer to the end of the search when the day began to fail. Tea time had gone long by, and it seemed supper time would do the same. There were moths fluttering about, and the light became very dim, for the moon had not risen. Bilbo's pony began to stumble over roots and stones, and they came to the edge of a steep fall in the ground so suddenly that Gandalf's horse nearly slipped down the slope.
"Here it is at last,"
he called, and the others gathered around and looked over the edge. They saw a valley far below, and they could hear the voice of hurrying water in a rocky bed at the bottom. The scent of trees was in the air, and there was a light on the valley side crossing across the water. Bilbo never forgot the way they slithered and slipped in the dusk down the steep zigzag path into the secret valley of Rivendell. The air grew warmer as they got lower, and the smell of pine trees made him drowsy, so that every now and again he nodded off and nearly fell off or bumped his nose on the pony's neck. And their spirits rose as they went down and down. The trees changed to beech and oak, and there was a comfortable feeling in the twilight. The last green had almost faded out of the grass when they came at length to an open glade not far above the banks of the stream. Smells like elves, thought Bilbo, and then he looked up at the stars, and they were burning bright and blue. And just then there came a burst of song, like laughter in the trees. "Oh, what are you doing, and where are you going? Your pony's been shoeing, the river is flowing. Oh, tra-la-la-lally here down in the valley. Oh, where are you seeking, and where are you making? The faggots are reeking, the bannocks are baking. Oh, trilly-lolly, the valley is jolly. Ha ha. Oh, where are you going with beards all a-wagging, not knowing, no knowing, what brings Mr. Baggins and Balin and Dwalin down into the valley in June? Ha ha. Oh, will you be staying or will you be flying? Your ponies are straying, the daylight is dying. To fly would be folly, to stay would be jolly, and listen and hark till the end of the dark to our tune. Ha ha. So they laughed and they sang in the trees, and pretty fair nonsense, I dare say, you think it. Well, not that they would care. They would only laugh all the more if I told them so. They were elves, of course, and so as soon Bilbo caught the glimpses of them as the darkness deepened, he loved elves. Though he seldom met them, and he was a little frightened of them too. Dwarves don't get on with them very well. Even decent enough dwarves like Thorin and his friends think them foolish, which is a very foolish thing to do, or get annoyed with them. For some elves tease them and laugh at them, and most of them at all, and most of all at their beards. "Well, well," said a voice, "just look. Bilbo the Hobbit on a pony, my dear, isn't it delicious? Most astonishingly wonderful." And then off they went into another song as ridiculous as the one I've just written down in full and just sung you. At last, a tall young fellow came down out of the trees and bowed to Gandalf and Thorin. "Welcome to the valley." "Thank you," said Thorin a bit gruffly, but Gandalf was already off his horse and among the elves, talking merrily with them. "You are a little out of your way," said the elf. "That is, if you are making for the only path across the water into the house beyond. We will set you right, but you had best get on foot until you are over the bridge. Are you going to stay a bit and sing with us, or will you go straight on?" "Supper is preparing over there," he said. "I can smell the wood fires for the cooking." Tired as he was, Bilbo would have liked to stay for a while. Elvish singing is not a thing to miss. In June, under the stars, not if you care for such things. Also, he would have liked to have had a few private words with these people that seemed to know his names and all about him, although he had never seen them before. He thought their opinion of his adventure might be interesting. Elves know a lot, and are wondrous folk for news, and know what is going on amongst the peoples of the land as quick as water flows or quicker. But the dwarves were all for supper as soon as possible, just then, and would not stay. On they all went, leading their ponies till they were brought to a good path, and so at last to the very brink of the river. It was flowing fast and noisily as mountain streams do of a summer evening, when sun has been all day on the snow far up above. There was only a narrow bridge of stone without a parapet, and over it they had to go, slow and careful, one by one, each leading his pony by the bridle. The elves had brought bright patterned lights to the shore, and they sang merry songs as the party went across. "Don't dip your beard in the foam, father," they cried to Thorin, who was bent almost on his hands and knees. "It is long enough without watering it." "Mind Bilbo doesn't eat all the cakes," they said. "He's too fat to get through the keyholes yet."
"Hush, hush, good people, and good night," said Gandalf, who came last. "Valleys have ears, and some elves have over-merry tongues. Good night."
And so at last they all came to the last homely house, and found its doors flung wide. Now, it is a strange thing, but things are good to have. It is a strange thing, but things are good to have, and days that are good to spend are soon told about, and not much to listen to, while things that are uncomfortable, palpitating, and even gruesome may make a good tale, and take a great deal of telling anyway. They stayed long in that good house, 14 days at least, and they found it hard to leave. Bilbo would gladly have stopped there forever and ever, even supposing a wish would have taken him right back to his hobbit hole without trouble, yet there is little to tell about their stay. The master of the house was an elf friend, one of those people whose fathers came into the strange stories before the beginning of history. The wars of the evil goblins and the elves and the first men of the north. In those days, our tale, there were still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for ancestors. And Elrond, the master of the house, was their chief. He was a noble, and as fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, and as wise as a wizard, and venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. He comes into many tales, but his part in the story of Bilbo's great adventure is only a small one, though important, as you will see if we ever get to the end of it. His house was perfect, whether you liked food or sleep or work or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. I wish I had the time to tell you even a few of the tales, or one of the two of the songs that they heard in that house. All of them. The ponies as well grew refreshed and strong in a few days there. Their clothes were mended as well as their bruises, their tempers and their hopes. And their bags were filled with food and provisions, light to carry but strong to bring them over the mountain passes. Their plans were improved with the best advice. So the time came to Midsummer Eve, and they were to go on again with the early sun on midsummer morning. Elrond knew all about the runes of every kind. That day he looked at the swords that had been brought from the troll's lair, and he said, "Those are not troll-make. They are old swords, very old swords of the high elves of the west, my kin. They were made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. They must have come from the Dragon's Hoard or Goblin's Plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many years ago. This, Thorin, the rune's name Orcrist, the Goblin Cleaver in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. And this, Gandalf, this was Glamdring, the foe hammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well." "Well, whence did the troll get them, I wonder?" said Thorin, looking at his sword with new interest. "I could not say," said Elrond, "but one may guess that your trolls had plundered other plunderers, or come down on the remnants of old robberies in some hold in the mountains. I have heard that there are still forgotten treasures of old to be found in the deserted caverns of the mines of Moria since the Dwarf and Goblin War. Thorin pondered these words.
I'll keep this sword in honour, he said. May it soon cleave goblins once again.
But a wish like that is to be granted soon enough in the mountains, said Elrond. But show me now your map. And he took it and he gazed long at it, and he shook his head, for he did not altogether approve of dwarves and their love of gold, and he hated dragons and their cruel wickedness. And he grieved to remember the ruin of the town of Dale and its merry bells, and the burned banks of the bright river running. The moon was shining in a broad silver crescent. He held up the map to the white light, and it shone through. What is this? He said. There are moon letters here, beside the plain runes which say 5 feet high and full. 5 feet high the door, and 3 may walk abreast. What are moon letters? Asked the Hobbit, full of excitement. He loved maps, as I've told you before. He also liked names and letters and cunning runes and handwriting, and though he wrote himself, it was a bit thin and a bit spidery. Moon letters are rune letters. But you cannot see them, said Elrond, not when you look straight at them. They can only be seen when the moon shines behind them. And what is more, where there is cunning, with the more cunning sort, it must be a moon with the same shape and season as the day when they were written. The dwarves invented them and wrote them with silver pens, as your friends could tell you. These must have been written on Midsummer Night's evening, in a crescent moon, a long while ago.
What do they say?
Asked Gandalf and Thorin together, a bit vexed perhaps even that Elrond should have found them and found this out first, though really there had not been a chance before, and there would not have been another until goodness knows when. Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, read Elrond, and the setting sun, with the last light of Durin's day, will shine upon the keyhole. Durin, said Thorin. He was the father of the fathers of the oldest race of dwarves, the Longbeards, and my first ancestor. I'm his heir. Then when is Durin's day? Said Elrond. The first day of the dwarves' new year, said Thorin, is all that you should know. The first day of the last moon is as all should know the first day of the last moon of the autumn on the threshold of winter. We still call it Durin's Day, when the last moon of autumn and the sun are in the sky together, but this will not help us much, I fear. Just trying to find the page. I just swiped a little bit too far to the right here. Where are we? Okay, where are we now? During I'll be with you back in a second. I'll be with you in 2 seconds here. Just hang on. And now, there. Okay, here we go. And what do they say? Asked Gandalf and Thorin together, a bit vexed, and perhaps that even Elrond should have found this out first, though really there had not been a second chance before, and there would not have been another until goodness knows when. Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks, read Elrond, and the setting sun with the last light of Durin's day will shine upon the keyhole. Durin, said Thorin. He was the father of the fathers of the eldest race of dwarves, the Longbeards, and my first ancestor. I am his heir. Then what is Durin's Day? Asked Elrond. The first day of the dwarves' new year, said Thorin, is as all should know the first day of the last moon of autumn on the threshold of winter. We still call it Durin's Day when the last moon of autumn and the sun are in the sky together, but this will not help us much, I fear, for it passes our skills in these days to guess when such a time will come again.
Well, that remains to be seen, said Gandalf. Is there any more writing?
None to be seen by this moon, said Elrond. And he gave the map back to Thorin, and then they went down to the water water where they could see the elves dance and sing upon the Midsummer Night's Eve. The next morning was Midsummer's Morning, as fair and as fresh as could be dreamed. Blue sky and never a cloud, and the sun was dancing on the water. Now they rowed away amid songs of farewell and good speed, with their hearts ready for more adventure, and with a knowledge of the road that they must follow over the misty mountains and to the lands beyond. Chapter 4. Over Hill and Under Hill. Cheers. There were many paths that led up into those mountains, and many passes over them. But most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere or to bad ends. Most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the hobbits, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. Long days after they climbed out of the valley and left the last homely house miles behind, they were still going up and up and up, and it was a hard path and a dangerous path, a crooked way and a lonely and long. Now, they could look back over the lands they had left, laid out far behind them below, far, far away in the west, where things were blue and faint. Bilbo knew there lay his own country of safe and comfortable things in his little hobbit hole, and he shivered. It was getting bitter cold up here, and the wind came shrill among the rocks. Boulders, too, at times came galloping down the mountainsides, let loose by midday sun upon the snow and passed among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. The nights were comfortless and chill, and they did dare not sing or talk too loud, for their echoes were uncanny, and the silence seemed to dislike being broken, except by the noise of water and the wail of wind and the crack of stone. The summer is getting on down below, and haymaking is going on, and picnics, and there'll be harvesting and blackberrying, and before we even get to go down the other side at this rate. And the others were thinking equally gloomy thoughts, although when they had said goodbye to Elrond in the high hope of Midsummer Morning, they had spoken gaily of the passage of the mountains and of riding swift across the lands beyond. They had thought of coming to the secret door in the lonely mountain, perhaps that very next last moon of autumn, and perhaps it will be Durin's Day, they had said. Only Gandalf had shaken his head and said nothing. Dwarves had not passed that way for many years, but Gandalf had, and he knew how evil and danger had grown and thriven in the wild since the dragons had driven men from the lands and the goblins had spread in secret after the battle of the mines of Moria. Even the good plans of the wise wizards like Gandalf and of his good friends like Elrond go astray sometimes when you are off on dangerous adventures over the edge of the wild. And Gandalf was a wise enough wizard to know it. He knew that something unexpected might happen, and he hardly dared to hope that they would pass. He hardly dared to hope that they would pass without fearful adventure over those great tall mountains with lonely peaks and valleys where no king ruled. They did not. All was well until one day they met a thunderstorm. More than a thunderstorm, a thunder battle. You know how a really big thunderstorm can be down in a valley or a riverland. Especially at times when two great thunderstorms meet and clash. More terrible still are thunder and lightning in the mountains, and at night, when the storms come up from the east and come up from the west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks and the rocks shiver, and the great crashes split the air and go rolling and tumbling into every cave and hollow, and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and light. Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. They were high up in a narrow place with a dreadful fall into a dim valley at one side of them. They were there sheltering under a hanging rock for the night, and he lay beneath a blanket and shook from head to toe. And when he peeped out into the lightning flashes, he saw that across the valley The stone giants were out, and they were hurling rocks at one another for a game, and catching them and tossing them and throwing them down into the darkness, where they smashed among the trees far below or splintered into little bits with a bang. Then came a wind and a rain, and the wind whipped the rain and the hail about in every direction, so that every overhanging rock was no protection at all. And soon they were getting drenched, and their ponies were standing there with their heads down and their tails between their legs, and some of them were whinnying with fright, and they could hear the giants guffawing and shouting all over the mountainsides. "This will not do," said Thorin. If we don't get blown off or drowned or struck by lightning, we shall be picked up by some giants and kicked down the sky high for a football."
"Well, if you know anywhere better, take us there," said Gandalf, who was feeling very grumpy and was far from happy about the giants himself.
Their end of the argument was what sent Fili and Kili to look for better shelter. They had very sharp eyes, and being the youngest of the dwarves by some 50 years, they usually got these sorts of jobs when everybody could see that it was absolutely no use sending Bilbo. There is nothing like looking if you want to find something. Also Thorin, there is nothing like looking if you want to find something. Also Thorin used to say to the young dwarves, you certainly find something if you look, but it is not quite the something that you were after. So it proved on this occasion. Soon Fili and Kili came crawling back, holding on to the rocks in the wild. "We found a dry cave," they said. "Not far around the next corner, and the ponies and all. They could get inside."
"Have you thoroughly explored it?"
said the wizard, who knew that caves up in the mountains were seldom unoccupied. Yes, they said, though everybody knew that they could not have been there too long about it, and they'd come back too quick. "It isn't that big, and it doesn't go back too far." That, of course, is the dangerous part about caves. You don't know how far back they go, sometimes, or where a passage may lead to, or what it is that's waiting for you inside. But Fili and Kili's news seemed good enough, so they all got up and prepared to move. The wind was howling and the thunder still growling, and they had a business getting themselves and their ponies along. Still, it was not very far to go, and before long they came to a big rock standing out into the path. If you stepped behind, you found a low arch in the side of the mountain, and there was just room to get the ponies through with a squeeze when they had been unpacked and unsaddled. As they passed under the arch, it was good to hear the wind and the rain outside instead of all about them, and to feel safe from the giants and their rocks. But the wizard was taking no risks. He lit up his wand, as he did the day in Bilbo's dining room that seemed so long ago, if you remember. And by its light they explored the cave from end to end. It seemed quite a fair size, not too large and mysterious. It had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks, and at one end there was room for the ponies. And there they stood, mighty glad of the change, steaming and champing in their nose bags. Oin and Gloin wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear it, so they spread out their wet things on the floor and got dry ones out of their bundles, and then they made their blankets comfortable, got out their pipes and blew smoke rings, which Gandalf turned into different colours and set them dancing up by the roof to amuse them. They talked and talked and talked and forgot about the storm, and discussed what each of them would do with his share of the treasure when he got it, which at the moment did not seem so impossible. And so they dropped off to sleep one by one. And that was the last time they used their ponies. Packages, baggages, tools, and paraphernalia that they had brought with them. It turned out a good thing that night that they had brought little Bilbo with them after all, for somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while, and when he did sleep, he had very nasty dreams. He dreamt that a crack in the wall at the back of the cave had got bigger and bigger and opened wider and wider. And he was very afraid, but he could not call out or do anything but lie and look. And then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving way and was slipping and beginning to fall down, goodness knows where to. At that, he woke up with a horrible start and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave and was already a wide passage, and he was just in time to see the last of the ponies' tails disappear into it. Of course, he gave a very loud yell, yell as a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins, big goblins, great, big ugly looking goblins, lots of goblins before you could say rocks and blocks, and there were 6 to each dwarf at least, and 2 even for Bilbo, and they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint, but not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done much good. It had wakened him up in a splintered second, and when the goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash like lightning in the cave, a smell like gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. The crack closed with a snap, and Bilbo and the dwarves were on the wrong side of it. But where was Gandalf? Of that neither they nor the goblins had any idea, and the goblins could not wait to find out. They seized Bilbo and the dwarves and hurried them along. It was deep, deep, dark, and such as only goblins that have taken to living in the heart of mountains can see through. The passages there were crossed and tangled in all directions, but the goblins knew their way, as well as you do, to the nearest post office, and the way went down and down and down and down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible stony voices, and Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the troll had picked him up by his toes. He wished again and again for the nice, bright Hobbit hole, not for the last time. And now there was a glimmer of red light before them, and the goblins began to sing or croak, keeping time with the flap of their feet on the stone and shaking their prisoners as well.
Snap, 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 the black crack. Grip, grab, pinch, nab, and down to the goblin town you go, my lad. Clash, crash, quash and smash, hammer and tongs, knockers and gongs, pounds, pounds, far underground. Ho, ho, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, work, nor dare to shirk, while goblins quaff and goblins laugh, round and round, far underground below, my lad.
It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to the clap, snap, and the crush and the smash, to the ugly laughter of the ho-ho, my lad, and the general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out their whips and whipped them with a swish and a smack, and was sending them running as fast as they could in front of them, and more than one of the dwarves were already yammering and bleating like anything when they stumbled into a big cavern. It was lit by great red fire in the middle, and torches all along the walls, and it was full of goblins. They all laughed and stamped and clapped with their hands, and clapped their hands when the dwarves, with poor little Bilbo at the back and nearest to the whips, came running in, while the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind. The ponies were already there in a huddle in the corner, and there were all the baggages and packages lying broken open and being rummaged by goblins, and smelt by goblins, and fingered by goblins, and quarrelled over by goblins. Well, I'm afraid that was the last they ever saw of those excellent little ponies, including a jolly, sturdy little white fellow that Elrond had led to Gandalf, since his horse was not suitable for mountain paths. For goblins eat horses and ponies and donkeys and other much more dreadful things, and they were always hungry. Just now, however, the prisoners were only thinking of themselves. The goblins chained their hands behind their backs and linked them all together in a line, and dragged them to the far end of the cavern, with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the row. There in the shadows, on a large flat stone, sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing around him, carrying axes and bent swords that they use. Now, goblins are cruel, wicked and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things. They make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any, but the most skilled dwarves, when they make trouble, when they take the trouble, though they usually are untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get other people to make to their design. Prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them. And also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days and in those wild parts had not advanced, as they called it, so far. as it is called so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the orderly and prosperous in some parts, wicked dwarves that had even made alliances with them. But they had a special grudge against Thorin's people because of the war which you have heard mentioned, but which does not come into this particular tale. And anyway, goblins don't care who they catch as long as it is done smart and secret and the prisoners are not able to defend themselves.
Who are these miserable persons? Said the great goblin.
Wasn't this, said one of them, one of the drivers, pulling Bilbo's chain as he fell onto the floor onto his knees, with thousands sheltering the front porch.
What do you mean by it?
Said the great goblin, turning to Thorin.
Up to no good, I warrant, spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of the elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say?
Thorin, the dwarf, at your service, he replied. It was merely, politely, nothing. Of all the things which you suspect and imagine, we had no idea at all. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused, and nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in whatever way. That was true enough, said the great goblin.
So you say, might I ask what you were doing up in the mountains at all? Where you were coming from and where you were going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already, but let's have the truth, for I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you.
Well, we were on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews, nieces, and first, second, third cousins, and other descendants of our grandfathers who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains, said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say all at once in a moment, which obviously the exact truth would not do at all.
He's a liar,
said one of the drivers.
Oh, truly tremendous one. Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they are as dead as stones. Oh, he has not explained this. Also, he has not explained this. He held out the sword which Thorin had worn, the sword that came from the troll's lair.
The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage. And he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth and clashed their shields and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did the battles before their walls. They had called it Orcrist, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins simply called it Biter. They hated it, and they hated worse anyone that carried it.
Murderers and elf friends,
the great goblin shouted.
Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes and never let them see the light again.
He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat, and he and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment when all the lights in the cabin went out, and the great fire went off, poof, in a tower of blue glowing smoke right up to the roof that scattered, piercing white sparks all among the goblins. The yells and the yammering, the croaking, the gibbering and jabbering, the howls, the growls, the curses, the shrieking, the shrieking that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wildcats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would not have compared with it. The sparks were burning in the goblins. The smoke that now fell from the roof made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over one another and rolling in heaps on the floor and biting and kicking and fighting as if they'd all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin as he stood there, dumbfounded in the middle of his rage, and he fell dead. goblin soldiers fled from before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into the sheath.
Follow me quick,
said a fierce voice and quiet, and before Bilbo understood what was happening, he was trotting along again as fast as he could trot. At the end of the line, down dark, more passages with yells of the goblin hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on.
Quicker, quicker,
said the voice. The torches will soon be relit.
Half a minute,
said Dory, who was at the back next to Bilbo and a decent fellow. He had made the hobbit scramble onto his shoulders as best as he could with tied hands, and then off they all went at a run with a clink-clank of chains and many a stumble, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. And not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must be right down in the very mountain's heart. And then Gandalf lifted up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. But just then, they were too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again and then flashed it in the dark by itself. And it burned with a rage that made it gleam as if goblins were about. Now it was bright as a blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. This sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater and hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Orcris too had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from one of the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he could not do everything, he could do a great deal for friends in a tight corner.
Are we all here?
He said, handing his sword back to Thorin with a bow. Let me see, 1, that's Thorin, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and Philly and Killy, here they are, 12, 13, and there's Mr. Baggins, 13, here they are, 12, 13, and here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, it might be worse, and then again it might be a good deal better. No ponies, no food, not knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind us. On we go! On they went. Gandalf was quite right. They began to hear goblin noises and hobgoblin horrible cries as far back as the passage that they had come through. That sent them on faster than ever, and as poor Bilbo could not possibly go as fast, for dwarves can roll along at a tremendous pace, I can tell you, when they have to, they took it in turns to carry Bilbo on their backs. Still, goblins go faster than dwarves, and these goblins knew the way better. They had made the paths themselves, and they were madly angry. So that do what they could, the dwarves heard the cries and howls getting closer and closer, and soon they could hear even the flap of goblin feet, many, many feet, which just seemed only just round the corner. The blink of red torches that could be seen behind in the red tunnel that they were following, and they were getting deadly tired. Why, oh why did I leave my hobbit hole? Said poor Mr. Baggins, bumping up and down on Bomber's back. Why, oh why did I ever bring a wretched little hobbit on the treasure hunt? Said poor Bomber, who was fat and staggered along with sweat dripping down his nose in heat and terror. At this point, Gandalf fell behind and Thorin was with him, and they turned a sharp corner. About turn! He shouted. Draw your sword, Thorin! There was nothing else that could be done. The goblins did not like it. They came scurrying round the corner in full cry and found Goblin Cleaver and Foe Hammer shining cold and bright right in their astonished eyes. The ones in front dropped like torches and gave one yell before they were killed. The ones behind yelled still more, leapt back, knocking over those that were running after them. Beater and Biter! They shrieked. And soon they were all in confusion, and most of them were hustling back the way that they had came. It was the way that they had come. It was quite a long while before any of them had dared to turn that corner. A long while before any of them had turned that corner. But by that time, the dwarfs had gone on again a long, long way into the dark tunnels of the goblins' realm. When the goblins discovered that, they put out their torches and slipped on soft shoes. And they slipped and chose out their very quickest runners with the very sharpest ears and eyes. These ran forward as swift as weasels in the dark, with hardly any more noise than bats. And that is why neither Bilbo nor the dwarves, nor even Gandalf, heard them coming, nor did they see them. But they were seen by goblins that ran silently up behind, for Gandalf was letting his wand give out a faint light to help the dwarves as they went along. Quite suddenly, Dory, now at the back again, carrying Bilbo, was grabbed from behind in the dark. He shouted and fell, and the hobbit rolled off his shoulders into the blackness, bumped his head on a hard rock, and remembered nothing more. Cheers. I hope you're all getting on all right. You're hanging in there. Here we go. Chapter 5. Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. He just imagined his fright. He could hear nothing. He could see nothing. He could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and he groped about on all fours till he touched the wall of the tunnel, but neither up nor down could he find anything. Nothing at all. No signs of goblins, no signs of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction that they had been going when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could and crawled along for a good way till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of gold, metal, cold metal, lying on the floor of the tunnel. It turned out that this was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly, it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. And he thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other, but that only made him miserabler. He could not think what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or why his head was so sore. The truth was that he had been lying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, and in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something, and he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. And then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all. And that shattered all his hopes completely, just as well for him as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought out in these dark holes in this horrible, horrible place. Still, at that moment he felt very, very crushed. But in slapping his pockets and feeling all around for his matches, his hand came upon the hilt of his little sword, his little dagger that he'd got from the trolls and that he'd quite forgotten, and nor fortunately had the goblins noticed as he wore it inside his breeches. So now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it's an elvish blade too, he thought, and the goblins are not very near, and not yet far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin, for the Goblin Wars of which so many songs had sung. And also he noticed that such weapons made a great impression on the goblins that came up upon them so suddenly. Go back, he thought. No good at all. Go sideways. Impossible. Go forward. It's the only thing to do. On we go. So up he got and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, his heart all of a pitter and a patter. Now, Bilbo was in certainly what is called a tight place, but you must remember it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for you or me, because hobbits are not quite ordinary people. And after all, their holes are nice, cheery places and are properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of goblins. And still, they are more used to tunnelling than we are. And They do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises. And they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard of or forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins's place all the same. This tunnel seemed to have no end. He knew that it was going still down, pretty steadily, and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, and he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or he could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these, he took no notice except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On and on he went, down and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. Now, I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, nor daring to stop. On, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to the days beyond. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into water. It was icy cold. That pulled him up sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage or the brink of a dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped and he could hear, when he listened, hard drops. Drip, 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 dripping, dripping from an unseen roof into the water below, but there seemed to be no other sort of sound. So it is a pool or a lake, not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging eyes wriggling in the water. And there are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of the mountains. Fish whose fathers swam in, goodness only knows how many years ago, and never swam out again, with their eyes growing bigger and bigger and bigger to try and see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish, even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves. There are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from the outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back in their beginnings to ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them with passages, and the original owners are still there in odd corridors, slinking and nosing about. Deep down here, by the dark water, lived old Gollum. A small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two round, big, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed about quietly on the lake, for lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold, and he paddled it with large feet dangling over one side, but never a ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out of his pale lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat too. Goblin, he thought. Good, when he could get it. But he took care when they found him out. He just throttled them from behind if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water when he was prowling about. Well, they very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they had found they could go no further, so their road ended in that direction, and they saw no reason to go that way unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed and at the end of his way and wits. And suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed.
Bless and splashes, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel it did make us. Gollum!
And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat, and that is how he got his name, though he always called himself
My precious.
The Hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him.
What is it, my precious?
Whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself through never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious, otherwise he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins. I have lost the dwarves, and I have lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know if only I can get away.
What's it got in its hands is?
Said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. A sword, a blade which came out of Gondolin, said Gollum, and then became quite polite.
Perhaps he sits here and chats with it a bit, see, my precious. It likes riddles, perhaps, does it?
He was anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, until he found out more about the sword and the Hobbit, and whether he was quite alone really, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them and sometimes guessing them had been the only game that he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before he lost all his friends and was driven away alone and crept down into the dark under the mountains. Very well, said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree, until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, or whether he was a friend of the goblins. You ask first, he said, because he had not had time to think of a riddle. So, Gollum hissed,
What has roots as nobody sees? As taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows.
Oh, that's easy, said Bilbo. Mountain, I suppose.
Does it guess easy? We must have a competition then with us, my precious. The precious asks, and it doesn't answer. We eats it, my precious, if it asks us, and we doesn't answer, then when we doesn't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out, yes?
All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do.
Chestnuts. Chestnuts,
he hissed.
Teeth, my precious, but we only has 6.
And then he asked his second.
Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters.
Oh, half a moment, cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Wind, of course. Yes, wind, he said. He was so pleased he'd made his mind up on the spot. This will puzzle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Said Gollum. He had been underground a long time, and he was forgetting this sort of thing, but just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before, where he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by a river.
Shh, my precious, he said. Sun on the daisies, it means, it does.
But these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry, so this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant.
It cannot be heard, it cannot be seen, it cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life and kills laughter.
Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all round him anyway. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, keys or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. He asked to gain time until he could think of a really hard one. This, he thought of a really dreadfully easy chestnut, though he thought had not asked it in the usual words, but it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and spluttered. After some time, while Bilbo became impatient, "Well, what is it?" he said. "The answer's not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you were making."
Give us a chance. Give me a chance, my precious.
"Well," said Bilbo, giving him a long chance, "what about your guess?" But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago and sitting under the riverbank teaching his grandmother to suck
Eggs!
He hissed,
Eggs it is!
and then he asked,
Alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in male, never clinking.
He also, in his turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one because he was always thinking of the answer, but he could not remember anything better at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question, and all the same, it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who had never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or you can guess it as easy as winking, since you are sitting comfortably at home and you have not the dangers of being eaten to disturb your thinking. But Bilbo sat, cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself.
Is it nice, my precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptious? Crunchable?
He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. Half a moment, said the Hobbit, shivering. I gave you a good long chance just now.
You must make haste,
said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat and onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out in fright and fell on Bilbo's toes. He said, "It's cold and clammy." And so he guessed. "Fish! Fish!" he cried. "It is a fish!" Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as he could so that Gollum could... Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as he could so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. No legs lay on one leg, 2 legs sat near on 3 legs, 4 legs got some. It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry, and Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had not asked it another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs was not so very difficult, and after that the rest was easy. Fish on a table, man at tables, man sitting on stool, the cat has the bones. That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and terrible. Then he thought, this is what he said.
This thing, all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays kings, ruins towns, and beats high mountains down.
Poor Bilbo sat in the dark, thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and the ogres he had ever heard told of in tales, but not one of them had done all of these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it, but he couldn't think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled back to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout, "Give me more time, give me time," but all that came out was a sudden squeal, as a sudden squeal was time, time. Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry and also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed, and this time he did not go back to the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo, and that made the Hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits.
It's good to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, just one more question to guess. Yes,
said Gollum. But Bilbo could simply not think of any question with the nasty, wet, cold thing next to him, and pouring and poking him, and he scratched himself and he pinched himself, and still he could not think of anything.
Ask us,
said Gollum.
Ask us.
Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself and gripped his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand, and there he found the ring that he picked up in the passage and completely forgotten about. God, what have I got in my pockets? He said aloud, and he was talking to himself. But Gollum thought it was a riddle and was dreadfully upset.
No fair. No fair, he hissed. It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask us what it's got in its nasty little pockets is it?
Bilbo, seeing that what had happened and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question and purely said again, "What have I got in my pockets?" He said it louder.
You must give us 3 guesses, my precious. 3 guesses.
Oh, very well. Guess away, said Bilbo.
Houses,
said Gollum. Wrong, said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his hands out again. Guess again, said Gollum, more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets: fish bones, goblin's teeth, wet shells, a bit of a bat wing, sharp stones to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think what other people kept in their pockets.
a knife.
He said at last. Wrong, said Bilbo, who had lost him some time ago. Last guess. Now Bilbo was in a much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question, and he hissed and spluttered and rocked himself back and forward. And he squirmed and wriggled, but still he did not dare to waste his last guess. "Oh, come on," said Bilbo, "I'm waiting." And he tried to sound bold and cheerful, but it did not feel at all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum was going to guess right or not. Time's up.
String or nothing,
shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, but working in 2 guesses at once. Both wrong, cried Bilbo, very much relieved. Then he jumped onto his feet at once, put his back to the nearest wall, held out his little sword. He, of course, knew that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played it. But he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it. And after all that, the last question had not been a genuine riddle, according to ancient laws. But at any rate, Gollum did not attack at once. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hands, and he sat still, shivering and whispering. At last, Bilbo could not wait any longer. Well, He said, "What about your promise? I want to go. You must show me the way."
Did you say so, precious? Show the nasty little pumpkins the way out. Yes. But what has it got in its pockets is not stream precious, but not nothing. Oh no, well.
"Never you mind," said Bilbo. "A promise is a promise."
Of course it is. Impatient, precious, hissed
Gollum, "But
it must wait, yes, it must. We can't go up the tunnel so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, these things to help us."
"Well, hurry up," said Bilbo, relieved to think of Gollum going away. He thought he was just making an excuse and did not mean to come back. What was Gollum talking about? What was useful? A useful thing that he could keep out in the dark lake, but he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was angry now and hungry, and he was miserable. He was a miserable, wicked creature, and he already had a plan. Not far away on his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, and there in his hiding place he kept a few wretched oddments and one very beautiful thing, very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring.
My birthday present,
He whispered himself, as he had often done in the endless dark days.
that's what we want now. Yes, we want it.
We wanted it because it was a ring of power. And if you slipped that ring of power on your finger, you were invisible. Only in the full sunlight could you be seen. And then only by your shadow, and that would be shaky and faint.
My birthday present. Oh, it came to me on my birthday, my precious.
So he had always said to himself, but who knows how Gollum came by that present ages ago in the old days when such rings were still at large in the world. Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first, until it tired him. And then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin till it galled him. And now, usually he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island and was always going back to look at it. And still sometimes he put it on when he could not bear to be parted from it any longer, or when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish. And then he would creep out along dark passages looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart. For he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe, because no one would see him. No one would notice him until he had his fingers on their throat. Only a few hours ago he had worn it and caught a small goblin imp. How it squeaked, and he still had a bone or two left to gnaw. But he wanted something softer.
Quite safe, yes,
He whispered it to himself.
He won't see us. My precious, no, it won't see us. And its nasty little soul will be useless, yes, quite.
And that is what was in his wicked little mind as he slipped suddenly from Bilbo's side, flat back to his boat, went off into the dark. Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him. Still, he waited for a while, for he had no idea how to find his way out alone. And suddenly he heard a screech. It sent a shiver down his back. Gollum was cursing and wailing in the gloom, not very far off by the sound of it. He was on his island, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain.
Where is it? Where is it?
Bilbo heard him crying.
Lost it is, my precious. Lost. Curses and crushes. My precious is lost.
What's the matter? Said Bilbo. Bilbo called. What have you lost?
It mustn't ask us,
Shrieked Gollum.
not his business, no. Gollum, it's lost. Gollum.
Well, so am I, cried Bilbo, and I want to get unlost, and I won the game, and you promised, so come along and let me out, and then go on with your looking. Utterly miserable as Gollum sounded, Bilbo could not find much pity in his heart, and He had a feeling that anything Gollum wanted so much could hardly be something good. "Come on," he shouted.
No, not yet, precious.
Gollum answered.
We must search for it. It's lost.
"But you never guessed my last question, and you promised," said Bilbo.
Never guessed,
said Gollum. And then suddenly out of the gloom came a sharp hiss.
What has it got in its pockets? Tell us that. It must tell first.
As far as Bilbo knew, there was no particular reason why he should not tell. Gollum's mind had jumped to a guess quicker than his. Naturally, for Gollum had brooded for ages on this one thing, and he was always afraid of it being stolen. But Bilbo was annoyed at the delay, and after all, he'd won the game pretty fairly and at a horrible risk. "Answers were to be guessed, not given," he said. "Well,
But that wasn't a fair question, said
Gollum, not
a riddle. No, precious. No!
Oh, well, if it's a matter of ordinary questions," Bilbo replied, "then I asked the first one. What have you lost? Tell me that."
What has it got in its pockets?
The sound came hissing louder and sharper, and as he looked towards it, to his alarm, Bilbo now saw two small points of light peering at him. A suspicion grew in Gollum's mind. The light of his eyes burned with a pale flame. "Well, what have you lost?" Bilbo persisted. By now the light in Gollum's eyes had become a green fire, and it was coming swiftly nearer. Gollum was in his boat again, paddling wildly back to the dark shore, and such a rage of loss and suspicion was in his heart that no sword had any more terror for him. Bilbo could not guess what had maddened the wretched creature, but he saw that all was up, and that Gollum meant to murder him at any rate. Just in time he turned and ran blindly back up the dark passage down which he had come, keeping close to the wall and feeling it with his left hand.
What has he got in his pockets?
He heard the hiss loud behind him, and the splash as Gollum leapt from his boat. "What have I wonder," he said to himself, and he panted and scrambled and stumbled along, and he put his left hand in his pocket. The ring felt very cold, and it quietly slipped onto his groping forefinger. The hiss was close behind him now, and he turned and saw Gollum's eyes like a small green lamp's coming up the slope. Terrified, he tried to run faster, but suddenly he struck his toes on a snag in the floor, fell flat with his little sword under him. In a moment, Gollum was on top of him, but before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave his sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. What could it mean? Gollum could see in the dark. Bilbo could see the light of his eyes palely shining even from behind. Painfully he got up, sheathed his sword, which was now glowing faintly again, and then very cautiously he followed. There seemed nothing else to do. It was no good crawling back down to Gollum's water. Perhaps if he followed him, Gollum might lead the way, might lead him to some way of escape without meaning to.
Curse it! Curse it! Curse it!
Hissed Gollum.
Curse the Baggins! It's gone! What has he got in his pockets? Oh, he does! He does, my precious! He found it, yes! He must have my birthday present!
Bilbo pricked up his ears. He was beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting as close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, not looking back, but turning his head from side to side as Bilbo could see from the faint glimmer of the walls. "My birthday present! Curse it! How did we lose it, my precious? How did we lose it?
Yes, that's it. When we finished my last, we twisted that nasty young squeaker. That's it, curse it, it slipped from us. After all those ages and ages, it's gone! Gone!
Suddenly Gollum sat down and began to weep. A whistling, gurgling sound horrible to listen to, and Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the side of the tunnel wall. After a while, Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to have an argument with himself.
It's no good going back to Roy to search. No, he doesn't remember all the places we visited. It's no use. The Baggins has got it in his promises. The nasty noses have found it. We says, we guess, precious. Only guesses. We can't know until we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. He doesn't know what the present can do, does he? He just keeps it in his pockets and he doesn't know. And it can't go far. It's lost itself. The nasty nosy thing. It doesn't know the way out. It said so. It said so, yes. Yes, but it's tricksy. It doesn't say what it means. It won't say what he's got in his pockets. But he knows. He knows the way in. He must know the way out, yes. It's off to the back door. To the back door! That's it! The goblins will catch it then. Yes, yes. Can't get out that way, my precious. Shh. Goblin says yes. But if it's got our present, our precious present, then goblins will get it. They'll find out what he does. We shan't ever be safe again. No, never going. One of the goblins will put it on, and then no one will see him, and he'll be there but not seen. Not even our clever eyes will notice him, and he'll come quicksy and tricksy and catch us. Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If the Baggins is going that way, we must go. Go in and see. Go! Not far now. Make haste!
And with a spring, Gollum got up and started shambling off at a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, still cautiously, though now his chief fear was of tripping on another snag and falling with the noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring he had was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in old tales, but it was hard to believe that he really found one by accident. Still, there it was. Gollum with his bright eyes had passed him, only a yard to one side. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing, and Bilbo behind going as softly as a hobbit can. Soon, they came to places where, as Bilbo noticed on the way down, side passages opened this way and that, and Gollum began to count them at once.
One left, yes. One right, yes. Two right, yes, yes. And two left, yes, yes.
And so on and so on. As the count grew, he slowed down and began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind and was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up.
7 right, yes. 7. 6 left, yes,
he whispered.
This is the way to the back door. Yes, here's the passage.
He peered in and shrank back.
But we dasn't go in, my precious. No, we dasn't. Goblins is down there. Lots of goblins is. We smells them. But what shall we do? Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see.
So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out, after all, but Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum sitting humped up right in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head, and he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but he was now on the alert. He had other senses that the darkness had sharpened, hearing and smell, and he seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hands splayed on the floor and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing, When stiff himself, he was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing. Put out its eyes. Kill it. It meant to kill him. No, that was not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him or tried to yet, and he was miserable, alone, lost, and a sudden understanding a pity mixed with horror welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless, unmarked days without light or hope of betterment. Hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leapt. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air. Indeed, had he only just missing cracking his skull on the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed the Hobbit as he flew over, but too late. His hands snapped thin air, and Bilbo, falling on his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not see what Gollum was doing. There was a hissing and a cursing almost at his heels at first, but then it stopped. At once there came a blood-curdling shriek filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, and lost too the only thing that he had ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on. Now, as faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice came from behind.
Thief! 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 Baggins! We hate it! We hate it! We hate it! Forever!
And then there was a silence. That seemed too menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near, then he smelled them, he thought. And they'll have heard his shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead you to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the Hobbit, except when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again several times on nasty, jagged stones on the floors. A bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, go along at great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply, and that slowed Bilbo down. But at last the slope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there, at the bottom of the short incline, he saw, filtering around another corner, a glimpse of light. Not a red light, as of fire or lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. And then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right into an open space where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine through a doorway where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins in full armour with drawn swords, sitting just inside the door, watching it with wide eyes and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, and ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a trick of the ring before it took a new master, it was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo, and forgetting how to draw his sword, he stuck his hands into his pockets, and there was the ring, still in his left pocket, and it slipped onto his finger. And the goblins stopped short. They could not see any sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud before, but not so delightedly.
Where is it?
They cried.
Go back up the passage.
Some shouted.
This way!
Some yelled.
That way!
Others yelled.
Look out for the door!
Bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, the armours clashed, swords rattled. The goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do, and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what had happened and to sneak behind the big barrel which held drink for the goblins' guards. And so to get out of the way, and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by feel. I must get to the door, I must get to the door, I must get to the door. He kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. Then it was like a horrible game of blind man's buff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he'd bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons got wedged into the edge of the door and on the doorpost, and he could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down into a narrow valley between tall mountains. Sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly one of the goblins inside shouted, "There's a shadow by the front door! Something is outside!" Bilbo's heart jumped to his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were still pricking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they came down soon after him, hooting and howling and hunting through the trees, but they don't like the sun, and it makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy, and they could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of shadows of trees, running quick and quiet and keeping out of the sun. So soon they went back to grumbling and cursing and to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. And that's the end of the chapter. So I'm just going to have a quick drink. Cheers. At this point, I'd just like to say, again, for those of you who missed it at the beginning, a big thank you to the Tolkien estate and to HarperCollins, who obviously published the book, who have allowed me to take the opportunity to read to you today and for this cause. And they've been incredibly supportive of the Hobbitathon COVID-19 appeal. So thank you very much to them for having a sweet for 2 seconds. How you doing? You all right? You bearing up? You hanging on in there? Oh, just blowing your nose. Oh, there's nothing up there. Anyway, okay. Enough. One last little suck. Good. Put that there for later. Okay. Chapter 6. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on till the sun began to sink westwards behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. And then he looked forward, and he could see before him only ridges and slopes falling away towards lowlands and plains, glimpsed occasionally between the trees. Good heavens, he exclaimed. I seem to have got on the right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where, oh, where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness that they are not still back there in the power of the goblins. He still wandered on out of the little high valley, over its edge and down to the slopes beyond. But all the while, a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now he had the magic ring, go back, whether he not ought to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He just made his mind up that that was his duty and that he must turn back. And very miserable he felt about it when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It was not did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding downwards towards a rocky wall on the left-hand side. And on the other side, the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. And in one of these dells, under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin. Doing lookout, he could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on, and for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without even noticing him. I'll give them all a surprise, he thought, and he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels and wondering and debating what they were going to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could possibly go on their journey without leaving Mr. Baggins in the hand of the goblins, without trying to find out whether he was alive or dead, or without trying to rescue him.
After all, he is my friend, said the wizard, and not a bad little chap, and I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him.
The dwarves wanted to know why he had never been brought at all, and why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense.
He's been more trouble than you so far, said one. If we ever have to go back now and into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say.
Gandalf answered angrily,
I brought him, and I don't bring things that are no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and leave you here and get out of the mess as best you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before this is over.
Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?
Oh, well, you would have dropped in, said Dory, if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark and tripped you up at your feet and kicked you in the back.
Then why didn't you pick him up again?
Oh, good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another, and you nearly chopped my head off with Glandry, and Thorin was stabbing here and everywhere with Orcrist, and all of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw goblins running back yelping, and you shouted, follow me, everybody, and everybody followed, and we thought everybody had, and there was no one time to count, and so you know quite well we still had to dash through the gate guards and out the lower doors and out the skelter down here, and here we are without a burglar. Confiscate him! And here is the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping out into the middle of them, slipping off his ring. Bless me, how they jumped. And they jumped and shouted with surprise and delight, and Gandalf was astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. They called to Balin and told him what they thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them like that without even a warning. It was a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a great deal in that moment with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was a really first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, I just crept along, very carefully and quietly.
Well, it's the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly.
Well, it's the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted, said Balin. I take my hat off to you.
Which he did.
Balin, at your service.
Your servant, Mr. Baggins, said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about finding the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shuddered most appreciatively at the description of Gollum. And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me, ended Bilbo, so I said, what is in my pocket? And he couldn't guess in 3 goes, so I said, what about your promise? Show me the way out. But he came to kill me, and I ran, and I fell over, and he missed me in the dark, and then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself, and he thought I really knew the way out, so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by it. So I jumped over him and escaped and ran down to the gate. What about the guards? They asked. Weren't there any? Oh, yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door. It was only a crack, and I'd lost lots of buttons, he said, sadly looking at his torn clothes. But, I squeezed through all right, and here I am. The dwarves looked at him with quite new respect, and when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum and squeezing through, and it was not very difficult or very alarming.
What did I tell you? Said Gollum, laughing. Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess. He gave Bilbo a queer look.
He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near the gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because they had found it quite safe up to now.
I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all.
As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins that they were grabbing, in the flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped out inside the crack just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the Great Hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows.
A very ticklish business it was, he said. Touch and go.
But of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments and with fire and lights. Even the hobbits had never forgotten the magic fireworks of old Took's midsummer parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction.
They made that gate ages ago, he said, partially for a way of escape if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come into the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. But they will guard it doubly after this, he laughed.
And the others laughed too. After they had all lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin, and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might have said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses.
We must be getting on now. We are a little rested, he said. There will be out after us in hundreds when the night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. Now there will be a moon. Now there will be a bit of a moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that we mind the moon too much, but it will give us a little light to steer by. Oh, yes, he said in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning when we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountains and are now on the other side. Quite a shortcut, but we are not at the point which our past would have brought us. We are far too far to the north and have some awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's get on.
I'm dreadfully hungry, said Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not eaten a meal since the night before last. I mean, just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose and his legs all wobbly, and now that the excitement was over.
Can't help it, said Gandalf, unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your little pony back and your luggage.
No, thank you, said Bilbo.
Well, very well, then. We must tighten our belts and trudge on, or we will be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves.
As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even the hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on the bank, but it was not much good. Then they went still on and on. The rough path disappeared, the bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage with the marjoram and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. And when they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet, and soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down and started other pieces below them still slithering and rolling, and then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with the dust and noise. Before long the whole slope above them and below them seemed on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled together, all in fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They were slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into the lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over, and the slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the last of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below.
Well, that has got us out of it, said Gandalf, and even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly.
I dare say, said Grumble Bobber, but they won't find it easy to send stones bouncing down on our heads. The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and they were rubbing their bruised and damaged legs and feet.
Nonsense. We are going to turn aside here out of the path of the slide. We are going to turn aside here out of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light.
The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down, they could see still the evening lights on the plains below. They limped along now as fast as they were able down the gentle slopes of the pine forest, in a slanting path leading to steadily downwards, southwards. At times, they were pushing through a sea of bracken with tall fronds rising above the hobbit's head. At times, they were marching along quiet as quiet over a floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest gloom got heavier and heavier, and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. Must we go further? Asked Bilbo. When it was so dark he could only just see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. My toes are all so bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack.
A bit further, said Gandalf.
After what seemed like ages, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up, was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right, and had a good deal nearer to them. Then by another not far to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living next to Mr. Baggins's hole at home, but he knew the noise, and he knew how to describe it often enough in tales. He had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took side, who had been a great traveller, used to imitate and to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much against wolves, especially against the evil packs that live under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains, over the edge of the wild on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins, and do not need to catch you. What shall we do? What shall we do? He cried. escaping goblins to be caught by wolves, he said, and it became a proverb. And it became a proverb, though now we say out of the frying pan and into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. Up the trees quick, said Gandalf, and they rose to the trees up at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had fairly low branches or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as ever they could, you can guess, and up they went as high as they ever could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Philly and Killy were at the top of a larch like an enormous Christmas tree. Dorry, Norrie and Orry and Gloin were more comfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking out at intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Biffa, Boffa, Bomber and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up in a tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in his boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo could not get into any tree. He was scuttling about from trunk to trunk like a rabbit that has lost its hole when it has a dog after it. You left the burglar behind again, said Norrie to Dorry, looking down. I can't always be carrying burglars on my back, said Dorry. Now down tunnels and up trees, what do you think I am? A porter? He'll be eaten if we don't do something, said Thorin, for there were howls all around him, getting nearer and nearer. Dorry, he called, for Dorry was the lowest down in the easiest tree. Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up. Dorry was really a decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hands down even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as ever he could. So Dorry actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble and stand upon his back. Just at that moment, the wolves trotted howling into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dorry did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had clambered off his shoulders and into the branches, and then he jumped for the branches himself. Only just in time, a wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up and nearly got him. In a minute, there was a whole pack of them yelping round the tree and yelping and leaping up at the trunk with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild fangs for the evil wolves over the edge of the wild were named cannot climb trees. For a time, they were safe. Luckily, it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long periods of time, but in the cold and in the wind, with the wolves all around them waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place of the wolves. More and more kept coming, and they left guards at the door at the foot of the tree in which Dorry and Bilbo were, and then went sniffing about until they had smelt out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in the great circle in the shade, and in the middle of the circle sat a grey wolf. He spoke to them in dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, as if all their talk was about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then, all of the wargs in the circle would answer their grey chief all together, and their dreadful clamour almost made the hobbit fall out of his tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in the wicked lands, in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture far from the mountains unless they are driven out and look for new homes, or are marching to war, which I'm glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days, they did sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. They often used to get the wargs to help and share the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had of late been making their way back into the In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had of late been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in and amongst the more pleasant woods in the valleys along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if they were many together, or in the bright day. But now they had planned, with the goblins' help, to come by at night upon some of the villages nearest the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none there left the next day. All would have been killed except a few goblins kept from the wolves and kept as prisoners to take back to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because of the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were very angry and puzzled at finding them here in their very meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodmen and were come to spy on them, and would take news of their plans down into the valleys, and then the goblins and the wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people waked suddenly from their sleep. So, the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape. At any rate, not until morning. And long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would be coming down from the mountains, and goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Now, you can all understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, a dreadfully afraid wizard though he was, and to feel that they were in a very bad place and yet had not escaped at all. All the same, he was not going to let them have their own way. Though he could not do very much stuck up a tree in a tall tree with wolves all around at the ground below, he gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of the trees. Then he set one alight with bright blue fire, and then threw it whizzing down amongst the circle of the wolves. It struck one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire. And he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. And then there came another and another, one in blue frames, one in red, one in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle, went off in coloured sparks and smoke. A especially large one hit the chief wolf on the nose. He leapt in the air 10 feet and then rushed out and rushed around the circle, biting and snapping, even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled the forest. The wolves are afraid of fire at all times, and this was the most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark had got into their coats, it stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over quickly, they were soon in flames. Very soon about the glade, the wolves were rolling over and over, trying to put the sparks out on their back, while those that were burning were running about, howling and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them and fled off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water.
What is all this uproar in the forest tonight?
Said the Lord of the Eagles. He was sitting there, black in the moonlight, at the top of the lonely pinnacle of rock on the east edge of the mountains.
I hear wolves' voices. Are the goblins at mischief in the woods?
He swept up into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leapt up to follow him, and they circled up in the sky, and they looked down from the ring of the wargs, a tiny spot far, far below. But eagles have keen eyes, and they can smell small things at great distance. And the Lord of the Eagles of the misty mountains had eyes that could look at the sun unblinking, and could see a rabbit on the move on the ground a mile below even the moonlight. So, though he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves and see tiny flashes of fire and hear the howling and yelping coming up from the far beneath him. Also he could see the glint of the moon on goblin spears and helmets as long lines of the wicked folk crept down the hillsides from their gate and wound into the wood. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountains were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped down and drove them shrieking back to their caves and stopping whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountains. Tonight, the Lord of the Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot, so he summoned many other eagles to join him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circling ever round and round and round, they came down, down, down towards the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. Well, wolves that had been caught in fire and fled into the forest had set it alight in places. It was high summer, and on this eastern side of the mountain there had been a little rain for some time. There had been little rain for some time. Yellowing bracken, fallen branches, deep piled pine needles, and here and there dead trees were soon in flames. All around the clearing of wargs was all round the clearings of the wargs, fire was leaping. But the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling round the trunks and cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red and fierce as flames. Then suddenly goblins came running up, yelling. They thought a battle with the woodmen was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and clashed their shafts and against their shields. Goblins are not afraid of fire, but they soon had a plan which seemed to them most amusing. Some got all the wolves together in a pack. Some stacked fern and brushwood round the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out, but they did not put out the fire nearest to the trees where the dwarves were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken, and soon they had a ring of smoke and flame all around the dwarves, a ring which they kept from spreading outwards, but it closed slowly in till the running fire was licking the fuel piled under the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes, and he could feel the heat of the flames, and through the reek he could see the goblins dancing round and round like people in a midsummer's bonfire. Outside of the ring, dancing warriors with spears and axes stood, and wolves and at a respectful distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins beginning a horrible song. 15 birds in 5 fir trees, their feathers were fanned in the fiery breeze. But funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what will we do with the funny little things? Oh, roast them alive or stew them in a pot, fry and boil them and eat them hot. They stopped and shouted out, "Fly away, little birds, fly away if you can. Come down, little birds, or you will get roasted in your nests. Sing, sing, little birds, why don't you sing?"
"Go away, little boys," shouted Gandalf in answer. "It isn't bird nesting time. Also, naughty little boys that play with fire get punished."
He said it to make them angry and to show them that he was not frightened of them, though of course he was, wizard though he was, but he took no notice and they went on singing.
"Burn, burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch, a fizzling torch to light the night for your delight. Yahee! Bake and toast and fry and roast 'em till their beards blaze, and eyes glaze till hair smells and skins crack. Fat melts and bones black in cinders lie beneath the sky, so shall dwarves die and light the night for your delight. Yay! Yahary hey! Yahey! Yahoy!"
And with that yahoy, the flames were under Gandalf's tree, and in a moment it spread to the others. The bark caught the fire and the lower branches cracked, and then Gandalf climbed to the top of the tree. The sudden splendour flashed from his wand like lightning. He got ready to spring down from on high right among the spears of the goblins. That would have been the end of him. And he probably would have killed many of them as he came hurtling down like a thunderbolt. But he never leapt. Just at the moment, the Lord of the Eagles, just at that moment, the Lord of the Eagles swept down from above, seized him in his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried the Lord of the Eagles, to whom Gandalf had now spoken. Back swept the great birds that were with him, and down they came like huge black shadows. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth, and the goblins yelled and stamped with rage and flung their heavy spears in the air in vain. Over them swooped the eagles, and the dark rush of their beating wings smote them to the floor or drove them far away. Their talons tore at the goblins' faces. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarves, who were scrambling up, now far away as they ever dared to go. Poor little Bilbo was very nearly left behind again. He just managed to catch hold of Dory's legs as Dory was borne off last of all, and they all went together above the tumult and the burning, Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now far below the goblins and the wolves were scattering far and wide in the woods. A few eagles were still circling and sweeping above the battleground. The flames above the trees sprang suddenly above the highest branches. They went up in crackling fire. There was suddenly a flurry of sparks and smoke, and Bilbo had escaped, only just in time. Soon the light of the burning was faint below, the red twinkle on the back door, and they were high up in the sky, rising all the time, in strong, sweeping circles. Bilbo never forgot that flight. Clinging onto Dory's ankles, he moaned, my arms, but Dory groaned, my poor legs. For the best of times, heights made Bilbo giddy. He used to turn queer if he looked over the edge of quite a little cliff. He had never liked ladders, let alone trees, never having escaped from walls before. Never had to escape from walls before. So now you can imagine how his head swam now when he was looking down between his dangling toes and saw the dark lands opening up wide underneath him, touched here and there with the light of the moon on a small hillside rock or a stream or plains. The pale peaks of the mountains were coming nearer, moonlit spikes of rocks sticking out of black shadows. Summer or not, it seemed very cold. His eyes shut and wondered if he could hold on any longer. Then he imagined he would. Then he imagined what would happen if he did not. He felt sick. The flight ended only just in time for him, for just before his arms gave way, he loosed Dory's ankles with a grasp and fell onto the rough platform of an eagle's eyrie. There he lay without speaking. His thoughts were a mixture of surprise at being saved from the fire and fear lest he fall off that narrow place into the deep shadows on either side. And he was feeling very queer indeed in his head, and this time, after the dreadful adventures of the last 3 days with nothing to eat, he found himself saying aloud, now I know what a piece of bacon feels like when it's suddenly picked up out of the pan on a fork and put back on the shelf. No, you don't, he heard Dory answering, because the bacon knows that it'll get back in the pan sooner rather than later, and sooner or later, and it's going to be hoped it shan't. I'll do that again. No, you don't, he heard Dory answering, because the bacon knows that it will get back in the pan sooner or later, and it's to be hoped that we shan't. Also, eagles aren't forks. Oh no, not a bit like storks. Forks, I mean, said Bilbo, sitting up and looking anxiously at the eagle who was perched close by. He wondered what other nonsense he had been saying, and if the eagle would think it rude. You ought to not be rude to any eagle when you're size of a hobbit and you're up in his eyrie at night. Right? The eagle only sharpened his beak on a stone and trimmed his feathers and took no notice. Soon another eagle flew up.
The Lord of the Eagles bids you to bring the prisoners to the great shelf.
He cried and was off again. The other seized Dory in his claws and flew away with him into the night, leaving Bilbo all alone. He had just strength to wonder what the messenger had meant by prisoners, and he began to think of being torn up for supper like a rabbit when his own turn came. The eagle came back, seized him by his talons, by the back of his throat, and swooped him off. This time he flew only a short way. Very soon Bilbo was laid down, trembling with a fear, on a wide shelf of rock on the mountainside, and there was no path down onto it save by flying, and no path down off it except by jumping over a precipice. And there he found all the others sitting with their backs to the mountains. The Lord of the Eagles was also there, and was also speaking to Gandalf. It seemed that Bilbo was not going to be eaten after all. The wizard and the eagle lord appeared to know one another slightly, and even be on friendly terms. As a matter of fact, Gandalf, who had often been in the mountains, had once rendered a service to the eagles and healed their lord from an arrow wound. So you see, prisoners had meant prisoners rescued from goblins only, and not captives of the eagles. As Bilbo listened to the talk of Gandalf, he realized that they were going to escape really and truly from the dreadful mountains. He was discussing plans with the great eagle for carrying the dwarves and himself and Bilbo far away and setting them down well on their journey and across the plains below. The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near men lived.
They would shoot at us with their great bows of yew, he said, for they would think that we are after their sheep. And none at other times they would be right. No, we are glad to cheat the goblins of their sport, and glad to repay our thanks to you, but we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southern plains.
Well, very well, said Gandalf.
Take us where and as far as you will, and we are already obliged to you, but in the meantime we are famished with hunger.
I'm nearly dying of it, said Bilbo in a little weak voice that nobody heard.
Then perhaps you can be mended,
said the Lord of the Eagles. Later on, you would or might have seen a bright fire on the shelf of rocks, and the figures of the dwarves round it, cooking and making a fine roasting smell. The eagles had brought up dry boughs for fuel, and had brought rabbits, hares, and a small sheep. The dwarves managed all the preparations. Bilbo was too weak to help, and anyway, he was not much good at skinning rabbits or cutting up meat. But being used to having had it delivered by the butcher, all ready to cook. Gandalf too was lying down after doing his part in the setting. Gandalf too was lying down after doing his part in setting the fire going, since Oin and Gloin had lost their tinderboxes. Dwarves have never taken to matches even yet, so ended the adventures of the Misty Mountains. Soon Bilbo's stomach was feeling full and comfortable again, and he felt he could sleep contentedly. Though really he would like to have a loaf of butter better than bits of meat toasted on sticks. He slept curled up on the hard rock more soundly than ever he had done on his feather bed and in his own little hole at home. But all night he did dream of his own house, and wandered in his sleep into all his different rooms, looking for something that he could not find, nor remember what it looked like. So we've got to chapter 7. I'm going to have a 2-minute comfort break, and I'll see you then, and you can do the same if you're still hanging in there. All right, hope it's going well for you. See you in a bit.